So welcome to the Node.js Next 10 team meeting for November 12th, 2020. We're going to look at some of the issues which were tagged for the agenda. We'll start out with number 353, which is doc add compatibility interrupt technical value. So I know, Jeffrey, you've been involved. I guess we've, Jeffrey, myself, Wes have all been involved. So if you want to kick it off, though, maybe we can go from there.
Sure. Yeah, this was my suggestion. Here, I can share my screen so we can all look at it if that helps. I just pasted it into the Google Doc itself, so we could just to have a little scratch pad.
Yep.
So I had opened a. Sorry, I don't know if this is supposed to be at the bottom or where we're putting notes, but
no, that's perfect.
Okay. Yeah, so I had opened a PR into that like technical values document, adding that text, and I had put it as priority 1, and I did mention that like later on in the document there was something under priority 5 that was like, interoperate with web APIs or something like that. But like basically what I said in the PR was basically like, we're a pretty prominent member of the JavaScript ecosystem. Interoperability should be like a really top priority for us, and like much higher than many of these other things. Like I would argue even higher than performance in most circumstances. And so like this should be a guiding principle for us that we that we use this to evaluate new APIs and new features that people want to make in Node, with the aim of bringing future Node closer to the mainstream of JavaScript, so that there's less and less JavaScript written for Node as opposed to JavaScript that Node can run as well as the browsers can run. I recognize that this is perhaps not the ideal language for it, but based on the comments in that thread, I thought maybe it would be easier to just debate the specific wording over a call rather than going back and forth on comments. But before we even get that far, maybe we should go back a step and see if we have, agreement or not about the overall intent here before we bicker over wording.
Yeah, my take is like, I think in the past discussions we did agree developer experience is like, that's why it's in the top priority, right? And I agree that part of the developer experience is being close to JavaScript and using the same standards. I think at least my interpretation is like, it's like how strongly we say that where maybe people have different thoughts is like, you could read the maximizing as like, well, just the absolute best developer experience is if it matches the JavaScript specs and what's done in the browser. And I think some of the actually, sorry, I have to promote somebody. At least like my opinion is that's true, but only up to a point. Like there's cases where it doesn't make sense, but for the rest of the cases where it does make sense, it obviously contributes to developer experience. So somehow just it fits in that first priority list, but it's kind of like to what strength in terms of like, what level of compliance actually helps developer experience versus doesn't. If you know what I don't know if I think I stumbled around a bit there, but
so maybe, can I add a little yep. color here? I think sure. And I made this comment, this was after our last meeting. The idea is, one of the ideas was to break out a new section to talk about how some of these values are sort of cross-cutting. So this, I think, is one great example of that, where we originally, when we were making lists, we kind of saw this as being a part of developer experience, which we did put on the top, right? But it also fits with some of these other ones lower down. And I think maybe there was a miss in that we didn't really describe fully all of the sections and how we had talked about them on the calls. and I'm wondering if maybe there's a way we could just come up with, instead of necessarily making this a separate value, finding a way to interleave this topic with the other values and say, look, this is actually a part of a bunch of our values, like developer experience, which is our top one, but it's also, yeah, you said it was in like one of the like 5 down. I can't remember exactly which.
It was priority 5. Let me find the document.
Up-to-date technologies and
Yeah.
APIs. Yeah.
But I don't think we need a new value. It's that, you know, it's just like these are examples of what, like those bullet points are not they're not like this is exactly what developer experience is, but they're trying to give some insight into what we think goes into that, right? So I don't really see a conflict between having them in multiple places.
That's kind of what I was trying to say. Is it seems to me like this specific one fits under developer experience, stability, and that by having specs underneath things, we can have a more stable API. It fits under up-to-date technologies. You could even, depending on the particular feature, you could even say a given, you know, spec from a web tech, you know, browser spec would fit under operational or maintainer experience. I think this one really does specifically cross the boundaries of all of them, which is why I think maybe not having a new value, but instead are better articulating that some topics will fit under multiple values, and then which ones those might be. Maybe just a different way to tackle this problem.
I mean, I guess it's a little, I guess I'm a little confused. Look, I'm just looking at the whole document now. I mean, the fact that it's like you have priorities 1 through 5, but then each priority has like a topic, you know, like priority 1 is developer experience. You know, you could just have like priorities 1 through 5, but not necessarily have them, you know, have topics that are meant to be like everything related to developer experience is priority 1. So therefore nothing related to stability can be in top priority. You know what I mean? Like,
well, I think we want, like the difficulty was we wanted to kind of like come up with something that would help in terms of like, if you're trying to consider something and it's going to have a balance across all these different things, like, you know, it'll affect developer experience, it's going to affect stability, you know, what do we think the project's values are in terms of influencing how you might make the decision? It's never black and white. Like priority, just because it's priority 1 doesn't mean that you then say, well, all the rest of them don't matter. But like if, you know, for example, if you had something which is perhaps, you know, affects stability, but is really, really good for developer experience, then you might make that choice, right? Kind of trying to help in those things. And I think if we pack in like, well, priority 1, there's these 6 different things, then it becomes, you know, almost impossible to reason at all like that.
Well, you could refer the 5th one that you already have, enabling supporting external packages to ensure overall developer experience. I mean, we could like rewrite that one to be like, you know, external packages. You could rewrite it to be like something like, you know, support external packages, including sharing code with other JavaScript environments or something like that. You know, like external code, not just for Node as like a Node package, but, you know, like we want to support stuff that runs elsewhere and or encourage stuff developed for Node to be like by default compatible with other things whenever possible, you know, something along those lines.
So I guess like one thought that I have, and apologies if I'm repeating stuff that has already been said, or if I'm missing the points a little bit. Like to me, what I would be concerned about longer term with something here is I think about like Node historically and the ideology of small core, right? Like, so small core, which was like not super well defined and maybe disagreed upon by other people, kind of got thrown around as like the primary architectural motivation when designing anything in Node, and then could be used to essentially like shut down work or say we shouldn't do this. And my gut is, Michael, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, is like a good part of these motivations are to undermine that kind of like anti-pattern in Node itself, but also to have like kind of clear motivations that we can point to when we're trying to make a decision. We could say, well, like, here's our philosophy, here's something we've agreed to. Would you agree with everything that I've said up until now? Or have
I wouldn't necessarily go to the undermining part, but it's the, like, to bring out what we think as a group is important, so that if we've got something that's clearly developer, like, really is good for the developer experience,
yeah,
but has some impacts to things like stability and operational qualities, that we can say, you know, it's still going to be a judgment call, right? Like, you can't do something that's great for developer experience but means you've like just broken half the ecosystem, right? But it would mean that we should consider giving up some stability if it's got a really good developer experience benefit.
So,
and it's sort of reasoning about those kind of things is the
yeah, and so like, I think what could be helpful here, and I'm not saying that this isn't what we have been doing, but like, if the goal right now, like a goal I personally care about, is ensuring that, you know, like implementing web standards and participating in that is something that we see as a priority, and that like in the future when having like discussions, like we don't end up saying like, well, we'll never do X because of like these things in the list, because like these kinds of lists do turn into like, you know, an artifact for litigation, for lack of a better way of putting it. So it's good to like ensure, and I think what Jeff is trying to accomplish here is ensuring that like in the modules team, for example, like spec compliance and writing something that was like browser interoperable was like actually our number one goal,
right,
when we were designing it. And so it is possible, and I'm not saying that this is what would happen, that, you know, 2 or 3 years pass, this kind of like historical thought process is maybe lost and a few of us have left, and now like all these changes start landing that aren't in line with that philosophy. Or alternatively, if we start trying to look at adopting new things, like that philosophy is not kept in mind. So I would imagine that the goal here, independent of how it's accomplished, is kind of ensuring something along the lines that, like, you know, we remain spec compliant to the JavaScript language, and that in best effort, we attempt to adopt standards rather than making proprietary solutions to problems. I think that's maybe like the core thing that we care about here. And whether or not this is like a stack rank thing, I think is a whole other thing. But I think what is important from a problem space here, not the solution, is that like that is captured in such a way that like when the people who cared about this kind of move on, that like in the same way that small core has stayed long past that time, that like, you know, JavaScript, like being like, I don't think right now anyone would argue we shouldn't be spec compliant. But there is arguably a world where like ECMA 262 no longer has the weight that it does, and we need to reevaluate that. But in lieu of like those things kind of falling apart, interoperability, I think, is an extremely important thing that was the core to Node's success in a lot of ways. Right.
So I don't think anybody's actually arguing that. Like, personally, I look at developer experience and I 100% agree that our compatibility with JavaScript, to the extent that we have, has been a really big part of the success. So I'm like totally supportive of adding a line in there. I think the caveat is that we just need to pick the wording, because it's not at all costs. And I think that's where some other people's concerns, and it's not like spec compliance always trumps everything else, but that doesn't mean that it isn't also an important part of the developer experience. So it's kind of like, you know, spec compliance, except for where it doesn't make sense. And that's where some of my suggestions, at least, we're trying to get at with the, like, we should, unless there's a good reason, like, you know, performance or what, you know, there's always an exception, right? And we shouldn't, it's that same thing. People were concerned about the, you know, people pointing this and say, oh no, spec compliance, you have to do the spec compliant thing. You can't do anything else because that's what we've said, right? It's kind of like, so to acknowledge that it's important, but give that, oh, but it's not an absolute kind of wording in there.
Mm-hmm. I guess like, and maybe this is like a separate thing altogether, and you can correct me if my understanding is wrong. I think that the fact that this list has like a hierarchy and order to it is actually kind of one of the things that causes a problem here, because these things are kind of fluid. So I don't know if the order and like working through it in order is like intentional, or if it was intentional, if that's like core. But maybe something that could be a solution here is, implying that all of these are important things, and that on a per case basis, you really need to think about all of these things holistically.
Yeah, I don't think that
Well,
changes
just
the message here. We actually came fairly easily to this sort of overall thing. I'm, Wes, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think like adding a line under develop experience, which is the priority one, which gives a nod to compatibility, but just with the right wording, is the way that fits in, and like basically is, in my mind, is a gap. Like part of the success and part of what the community values, like developer experience is really the thing that is the top value, and compatibility is part of the developer experience. So it belongs there. It's just,
can I just take one step back just to say,
Yep.
to address one of Miles's specific points. The reason I think we did this structure was we were looking at the nice way that the HTML spec says, like, implementers. Oh, I can't remember the exact order of all the things, but it's right. It's like users over, everything's over purity or something, right? Like whatever that that ordering that the HTML spec has, that's like the really nice one-liner, was we wanted, and people use that as a guideline when they're trying to make decisions, not as any hard rule. So we were trying to come up with significantly abstract enough top level things that people could use it as a thing to say, like, yeah, this, in this case, while developer experience is sort of a nebulous, thing, we as a project value it more than the operational qualities if it's meaningfully, part of the decision. And it's not necessarily that any, like, we didn't want it to be like ultra specific, so that we could have sort of these meta discussions and use it as like a ruler, or a thing you just kind of point at in the distance, right? Like a, not a, I'm trying to think of the right wording, you don't necessarily have, like, it's not like a guidebook and you like read it and follow it step by step. Like the goal was to have some sort of like high level principles, and then we could come up with any given situation, how to balance that decision making using this sort of rule, set of hierarchy, that we've set up. Does that like help make sense why we did it the way we did at all?
Yeah, I think it makes sense. And I guess like just kind of part of the challenge here is like the importance of this is biased by the folks in the room, and the people in the room change over time. And what I could see ends up happening here is like this being used almost like a written law to say, well, like one always trumps two, and I can make an argument about one, and then that's used to kind of like undermine specific work.
That's definitely something that I think we need to be very conscientious of.
I mean, that's exactly how I read it when I that's what led me to propose to do a PR, because I saw web API compatibility way down here in the bottom priority, and stuff like performance higher up, and I was thinking like, oh wait, so you're just always gonna prioritize performance over compatibility? You know what I mean? And that's how I read this document, and I was like, wait a minute, that's not, that should not be, especially when one was like wherever performance is,
so this is where I'm wondering,
like, because it was so much higher, it seems like, well, that's always going to win, so therefore we need to put something else higher than that,
Yeah, so maybe would it be valuable to go through a like example first, so that people don't, so that we can influence people's interpretation of the set of hierarchy here. so that we don't have that problem, right? Like instead of necessarily trying to like change these so that we don't, because somebody's still going to come in, even if we change them and make them quote unquote perfect, somebody's going to come in and do this exact thing and read it and go, oh, well, but I think this one's higher than that one. And like, we need to nitpick it, which I do think we need to nitpick it. This is a very important conversation. And I think our presentation of these ideals is, I think everybody agrees, is probably going to clearly lead to this sort of problematic future where people use it as a rule book.
I mean,
I
not
think,
its intent.
Yeah, Chris's point though is valid, important as well. Like this is really just to reflect today what the values of the project are. So like, you know, Miles' comment about like people having moved on. Once everybody's moved on, the values may be completely different.
But maybe that is something that we can include as like, to steal from standards, non-normative text. Like maybe we need some commentary at the bottom of this document, just saying like, this is a living document. It should reflect the values of the project. It should be revisited on an annual basis.
That we could definitely
things need to be understood on a holistic basis, and every decision needs to be visited. I just like, I think that at least when I first saw it, and to be honest, I only have so many spoons and energy, and I was just like, I trust you all, so I didn't like bother really getting into it. But I did have a bit of a like similar feeling to Jeff, but I also trust that this would be a living document. But I think being explicit about that could help us avoid some of the anti-patterns that I've seen in the project before, where like, you know, some of these things turn into lore, that lore turns into like, I know this isn't the case as much anymore, but when I started in the project 5 years ago, performance and small core were used by a subset of the project to just shut down work they didn't care about. Like it was used to like stop promises from being a thing. And so I would just like us to make sure that this is the kind of thing that cannot be used to halt progress, which I don't think is the intent, but like,
but I think it is. Like if somebody came along with something that says, and the argument is this is going to destroy developer experience.
Mm-hmm.
This is guide. Like if somebody comes to the project who doesn't know the project, this will tell them, if you're going to do something that, you know, is really bad for developer experience, probably not going to go over that well.
Mm-hmm. And to the point you were raising earlier, like basic JavaScript, like being spec compliant to the JavaScript language and being able to write portable code. And maybe that's even just something that we could add to that first one. I see that as like core developer experience.
Well, that's my point. Like I just think that I'd be happy if we just took out maximizing. I don't know if Wes, if that addresses your concern, but like if it just said compatibility and operability with browsers and other JavaScript environments where it makes sense. Like I think that should be part of that developer experience set of bullets.
So don't get me wrong, I'm perfectly in support of that. But I think the point that is brought up here is just deeper, in that we need to make sure this document's intent is because we can add bullet points. That's the point. We don't want to continually have every one of these conversations as an individual like nitpick, because they're all valid points, right? Like this is a very valid point, and then we have to spend a lot of time like always pointing back to this document and changing it a little bit here and a little bit there. If we just put, you know, sort of this disclaimer that says like, these are examples, this is not all encompassing, you know, please don't use this as something you know, point to and say, well, look, number one says this and number two says this. Like it is a living, you know, expression of our values, not a constitution by which we need to uphold in the way we make decisions, right? Like,
yeah, I think we can do both of those though, right?
True. Yeah,
like totally. I kind of see that like like I do see that we missed something under the developer experience, because I do think that the compatibility was key to the success. So that I just think, you know, that's why I'm like, we should add something on that. It's getting it so that it's not, I know there's some concerns where it's like, it's not at any cost, right? And I don't think it's that strong, but I do think it deserves some mention. And then we can add, some extra, if we think that people are coming to it and reading it the wrong way, we should also look at adding extra sort of the words around that share the intent that we have here.
Yeah, I think making more line items under priority 1 this one being a great example, I think is a fine addition, as long as we also go through the effort to try to write, like I think the comment, Miles, you said was not normative. Like we just need to make sure that it, you know, and I don't even think at the bottom of the document, I think that should probably be top of the document so people don't come in and read the whole thing and go, I disagree with all this, rearrange everything, right? Like, because they may have good reason for that, right? It's just, but that's not the point. The point is so that people who come in and are unfamiliar with the way the project is can like have some sort of frame of reference for, you know, so they don't come in saying, look, but up-to-date technologies, you mean you haven't implemented this new thing that's not even built into all the browsers yet? Like it's on your list. And it's like, well, it's on our list, but like that would make for a bad developer experience because it might change a spec. Like having this document just helps us have those conversations in a way where we can be on the same page on what the values are, not necessarily as the like decision-making framework. I think that,
well,
but
I think this is a decision-making framework. I mean, why else would you write this document? Like we're not writing it just to, you know, record for posterity how we felt about the project at the moment. Like
maybe my wording there was maybe not quite right. I don't mean that it's not a decision-making framework. Yeah, I guess what I mean is it's not a law set down. It is a way that we of the project have come together to try to formalize the way we might think about a problem.
So I think maybe something, God, I know way too much about constitutional law now, joking. But like constitutional scholars have different ways of reading text, and there's like originalism, right? Which is like the way it was written in the context of the people who wrote it is the only way to interpret it. And then, you know, there's other ways of interpreting things that are like much more like it's a living document. And this is something that comes to like religion and like how different religious sects approach things as well. So like, anyways, without getting too much into that, I think what we're getting to right now that would be very helpful would be just like a guide to understanding the doc at the top, setting that intention clear. And then I think secondly is making a commitment to those seeing the doc, that it's a living doc, that it will be reviewed at a certain cadence by the steering committee, and that further that it is something that is open to discussion and debate unless it isn't. But I think like, you know.
I know, of course, it's like as the values of the project change, this should change, right? It's meant to capture what we believe as a project as best we can versus dictate what it is going. You know, it shouldn't be used to prevent the project from changing.
And I think that making that very clear,
right,
and committing to that is important, because the biggest risk is these things, you know, become constitutions, become religious documents, become like this is the cart, not the horse. This is like we're working on a thing, so we're trying to make it easier to work on the thing. This shouldn't be the thing that makes it harder to work on the thing. Yes. So, yeah.
Okay, so I mean, I think one would be good, like if we could agree on the text that would go for a bullet point that would go underneath one, right? Like I think that there was some concern that the proposal, like the maximize, was a bit too much on the at all costs. It must be. So I think if we soften that a little bit and add something, that's.
I'm fine with that. I think where it makes sense is a little that somehow that bothers me. Like it feels like a little too vague.
Yeah, you know? I mean, I don't know if there's a better way, you know, to express that.
One of the things like that I was saying there was less about like compatibility with browsers, right? But more about like spec compliance with the JavaScript language and portability of code. Because this doesn't have to do with like, hey, we support every single API, right? This has to do with like the core, like, and this was the core fundamental thing that we talked about in the modules group. If we do things with like our module loader that will never be like interoperable with the browser, then like Node is its own thing. And that kind of like core developer experience that like, actually, you know what? Maybe there's another way of putting this, that like the skills of being a JavaScript developer are like portable from Node to other environments. I don't think that that's like what we should put down there on the list, but when we're thinking about developer experience, like that is one of the fundamental things. Like I don't need to learn like things about Node to understand like the core fundamentals of writing JavaScript, like the language. I may need to learn about like certain APIs and how those APIs work, but the fundamental language, the fundamental things of how you use it are the same.
Yeah, I could imagine something like, you know, the ability to leverage JavaScript experience in other environments like the browser and or whatever in Node or
yeah, because it's not about like having the document object in Node. It's that like that Node.js is a compliant runtime, and the skills needed to use it are portable to other JavaScript environments.
I mean, I think that's almost a different point. I think that's a really good point, but I mean, it definitely speaks to developer experience that like as a developer, I don't need to take a tutorial on JavaScript and then a tutorial on Node or something like that. I think it's like, for me, what's most important is like, I want us to do things that like increase the share of JavaScript that's written in the world that runs in Node as well as in browsers. You know, like we shouldn't, like if we're gonna introduce a new API, it should be an API that we can share with browsers, or you know, that's compatible with browsers or something like that. So that we're not, like Node is already probably the biggest offender in the JavaScript ecosystem for like creating like a silo. You know, like there's all these projects like Browserify and
I think the
whatever,
challenge to
Pika and
that,
so on, for getting Node packages to work in browsers, but that's always like this conversion step. Like the idea should be that we want to have that no longer be the case going forward, that like code should just be written and it can work in both places. And then by definition, that speaks to Miles's point that you wouldn't need to know so much that's specific to Node. Like, yeah, we're not going to add a window object with the DOM API and stuff like that. But like
So-
if we add fetch, for example, you know, well, it should be the same API as the fetch that browsers have. You know what I mean? Like that's the kind of thing I want to, that's the kind of, like if I want to influence a future decision, it's that kind of thing. Like when we add support for fetch, when we add support for service workers, you know, we use the same API, so therefore code can run the same in both places, that type of thing.
but I think the challenge to that to a certain extent, Jeff, is that like there needs to be an equitability there of folks on both sides to make that kind of commitment. And historically, for
Both
better
sides,
or
meaning like
worse,
browsers?
yes, like the What Working Group, the W3C, and specific folks who work there are not super on board with worrying about Node's use cases. And so like Fetch is a great example there. The stuff that's going on right now with like small changes to the URL API is another example. The folks who work as browser vendors who work on things, especially in What Working Group, but in other specs as well, aren't thinking about Node and aren't necessarily super flexible. So like, well, I live in the same idealized world as you, wanting that to be a reality, I also think we need to be careful. And I think this is what Mary's saying in the chat as well, about like how we frame this, because we could be doing it in such a way that like ties our hands, or like is like, I think we need to find a balance between like what we can accomplish and ideally what we'd want to accomplish, sadly.
Well,
I mean,
and also reflect what the broader consensus is, right? Like I doubt we'll find too many people in the collaborator space that would say, when we come to create something, we should just invent our own API for something that already exists.
So
But on
that's
the
what
other hand, go ahead.
I think you might be wrong there.
Okay, well,
I mean, we've had a bunch of examples of this, and we have I mean, the web streams, I mean, even the URL. We're now having this battle. I say battle. We're having this discussion. It's a great discussion with great points on all sides about how the URL spec isn't fast enough to be the basis for the rec.url. And it's like, well, is it? We have our own URL, right? So like,
so, but I guess where I was going though is like, just out of principle, nobody wants to create a new API, but they do run into cases where they don't think it makes sense to use what's out there, and part for some of the reasons that Miles outlined.
Well,
but there's also times where, like, if we look at Worker, for example, Worker was designed in such a way that it could be the building block of making a compatible API. And like like where we are as a platform from like an abstraction level is also like an interesting challenge. If
I could just respond to an earlier point though, it's like,
yeah,
because we've had like in these modules meetings, Bradley is often like, I think he feels very bitter about whichever group, what WG maybe, or TC39, I forget which. And I'm just like, well, but wait, but the such and such standard body is never going to support that. And he's just like, so they're assholes. What do we care? And like, he's just like so bitter of all the years of dealing with them that like, he doesn't care that how they feel about it and so on. Or if maybe they don't feel about it because they don't care about Node. But I just feel like, I understand that frustration, and I feel like you've felt it too, Miles. You've had to battle these groups too. But in a way, users don't care, and ultimately users are the losers in this situation. It's almost like parties in Congress bickering over things, and ultimately the people lose. We don't have that. We have the power to ignore them if we want to, but whenever we do, users suffer that consequence. So
I need to push back against that a little bit though, because I don't think the comparison of like Congress is necessarily useful there. It's like these are existing, but these are existing bodies that have use cases and have goals that just don't align with ours. It doesn't necessarily make it bad. And I think that was something that I was just trying to point out, where it's like for the What working group and for their URL spec, their primary motivation and their primary care there is the browser. And the same is true with the console spec. And there are ways in which we're not like console.assert throws a node, will never throw in the browser. That's just like, it won't happen. And we can't reconcile that. And so I think it's more about like understanding and respecting that these things are different and that like we can't always do these things. And so I think especially as like a tier 1 thing that we're talking about here, I think that there's definitely like a balance to be had, and there isn't necessarily a right answer. And truthfully, if we talk about DX as being the most important thing versus like standardization, we could look directly at the way in which we're talking about importing JSON in our module loader as a really great example here, where like we're trying to specify at TC39 JSON modules. And in the meantime, the thing is sitting behind a flag because the syntax that we can write in Node right now will never be what ships in the browser because of security concerns, and it requires like a whole new syntax feature in the language. So we're actually arguably making developer experience worse right now for like the long-term interoperability and compatibility. I point that one out specifically because I actually think it perhaps flies in the face of this document and listed priorities. But like long-term, the developer experience will be better.
Right. You could argue that having a developer experience where Node allows import of JSON and browsers don't, or they both allow it, but they behave in a different way, is arguably an even worse developer experience. Like, it's a worse developer experience for anyone who has to, develop code that runs in more than just Node. It
sounds like this is trading off developer experience now for developer experience later too, which is, I think, another factor we don't have in this, right?
But the developer experience later is primarily about interoperability. And so
that's what I was saying. It's part of developer experience is having interoperability. But sometimes you may look at the developer experience now and say, look, we're going to have a worse one now so that we can maintain that interoperability, which will lead to a better one later. And that still fits fully within this framework of thinking, right? Is like the goal is maybe long-term developer experience could be even the way to phrase that.
Well, or another way of putting it is like what you're doing with URL is like the global URL object is the same API as in browsers, but then we still offer the like quote unquote better URL API that you could import from a module. that's fine. You know, that's at least not like a foot gun where people expect URL to behave the same way in JavaScript here and JavaScript there. You know, like the reason I was like pressed to do this is like I'm a full stack developer, but my experience with a lot of the Node collaborators is that a lot of them only ever write code for Node. And so it's not really top of mind for them, like how is this going to run in a browser, or do browsers have this API, or does this API behave differently in browsers? And so they might not value that very highly. And that's why I was trying to push this in here, is like, you know, the Node collaborators are disproportionately a Node centric group who might not be developing for browsers, but the users of Node are not necessarily like that. You know what I mean?
So, but this is not necessarily meant to change the values of the project. This is meant to reflect the current values. So, you know, that's where I sort of fall back to, like, I think you'll find people would agree with like compatibility and interoperability where it makes sense, but I don't think, at least my take of the you know, what I've seen across the project is you're not going to have consensus on compatibility at any cost.
I'm not saying at any cost, but you know, there are degrees of incompatibility. There's like the URL example where we ship both, and the incompatible one needs to be imported. JSON modules where the non-standard behavior needs to be enabled to the flag. Like those are the types of things that, you know, I think would be good steps for us to take in order to have Node continue to be a good citizen in the ecosystem, and then be easier for users because Node behaves more like other JavaScript environments. You know,
if I can interject something, perhaps what we're having here is a bit of an impedance mismatch, specifically in that, and maybe what we're seeing is different subsystems and different parts of the project may have different orders here. But like, I think this gets back to like the kind of stack ranking this and how it can become like a little bit difficult. And maybe modules is an outlier here, and that's why like it's particularly it's something that is like particularly touchy for Jeff and I. But perhaps like another thing we can include in like a non-normative caveat is that, like, you know, different working groups or subsystems may prioritize these things in different ways, or potentially even have their own ideals that don't necessarily completely align with this framework. But this framework does the best to reflect kind of a broad vision of how Node works.
Yeah, I mean, we can easily add some wording around that as well, like, because that's true.
Because like for something like streams, like Node streams, which is something that like I would argue, I don't, Mateo, I'm sorry, but there is no DX. It's just like a nightmare to use, but it's like super fast, and we need to keep it for compatibility reasons. Like we may, this framework doesn't necessarily match at all when thinking about investing labor and time into developing streams. I'm trying to think of extreme examples here, but you know, I think there's a difference between that and like, what is the framework that we use to decide to introduce new APIs is like different than like, what do we think about when we're trying to maintain parts of the project?
So I think that it's clear we need to add like different axes of how we think about this type of stuff. I think that's pretty clear. But I think that the high level goal was to have a single point that did capture the things that work across the whole project when we started out with this.
Yes.
Do you see any way we could, like, you keep on, it sounds like you come back to the fact that they're ordered is what it sounded like in what you just said. Do you think simply removing the ordering would help people in that regard?
I think it could, unless the ordering is an important facet and part of the signal you're trying to get across, which it seems to me like developer experience being the most important thing is like kind of an important signal from this document, and not one that I necessarily disagree with. I think similar to small core, it gets into like the nuts and bolts of like, what do we define as that developer experience, right?
Sure.
Yeah, and that's a struggle,
speaking of which,
right?
where is small core on here? There's like small binary size, but that's not quite the same thing.
Well, I mean, good riddance.
No. All right.
Honestly,
right? Like,
I
you
feel
know,
the same way,
it's
but I think that's it could get added. I mean, if y'all think it should be added, we can discuss adding it. It just didn't come up in the people who were on that meeting that came up with this initial list.
well, this
So,
and
you know.
nor in anybody who looked at it in the PR that went in, right?
But I really do think we've come up on the one of the cruxes of this problem is coming up with something we can all agree on that doesn't get misused is definitely the goal, and we haven't quite hit the nail on the head yet. And I think that coming up with a way that we can maybe split out some of these topics and have, you know, maybe we go into less detail in the like high level doc, and it just has like, here are 5 things we think are important, and then have like a section under it that says, when you're thinking about specific problems, certain ones may be more important than others. Here's an example, you know, and maybe we outline like in performance critical code, like performance will be more important than some other things. In end user APIs that we see people using, user experience should, or, you know, developer experience should be the most important. Like, we could go through an exercise and maybe outline a few of those examples of how to apply this list and say, like, we do think there's an order. We do think user experience in the end should be like close to the top for most decisions. But like, there are some things where those details get lost, and then maybe do that kind of thing, and then have maybe a separate area where we go into what we have now as sort of these bullet points, and we say, like, these are what we mean when we say developer experience. Like, maybe we have like a definition section that like starts to drill more into some of those details, so that people just reading the first doc don't get lost in those.
But I'm like, the more like I think it's that there's consensus on developer experience. There is some ambiguity over what that means and some disagreement, but I don't think that necessarily invalidates that we value developer experience as a project.
So I think something that Wes said, Michael, that really resonated with me there, like, I think about code of conducts. Like, one of the things that I've heard about writing a good code of conduct is you don't want to just start enumerating every single like thing that can be a violation, because all of a sudden now we have two problems. One, that we're writing like an infinitely long list, and the second is now you have a thing that people can game by pointing at the document and saying, well, the thing I cared about, I said, isn't on that list, so you can't like do anything, when really we care about the spirit of it. So maybe there really is something there, Wes, to like not having the initial thing you're seeing being like all of these enumerations, and then kind of having like just having that list of like, here are like the 5 things that are most important to Node, and we can even have the order there. Then having something that says, you know, in particular cases, some things may be more important. But I would argue that in the cases where we're
just be explicit that it's unordered, just, you know, regardless of whatever order it appears in the, or unprioritized, regardless of however the order appears.
But I think, and I could be wrong, that in almost every case, developer experience still does kind of come out on top. Because like, why are we worried about making performance so fast? Well, I guess actually there's a difference too, I guess, between like the developer experience of writing the thing and the experience of the people who are using the thing, which are like 2 different things. The people using the services
that's user experience versus developer experience.
Yeah.
Right.
And we already have that enumerated in our list with Node.js maintainer experience, which is what you're describing there, right? Which is like, we're building a new API in Node. Those are the people we say we do need to optimize in some ways for those people, right? The maintainers, which is different from the...
Well, I was thinking the end users, the people who are just running the code,
right.
Like visiting a website.
Right. We were trying to split out priority 1 is the end users and priority 4 is the maintainers.
Well, there could be 2 end users. There's the end users who are writing Node code, like I'm a Node developer, but then there's the end user, like, you know,
I'm going to Netflix.
My wife, who's going to Walmart.com that runs on Node.com, or that runs on Node, and therefore Walmart website runs fast.
Much more like there's a lot of layers between us and that.
To an extent, but if you think about,
I think we covered this already with the constituencies.
Yeah.
I think what you described there, Jeffrey, I think we have almost exactly in the constituencies deal, and there we sort of try to go into which of these values and which technical concerns apply in different constituency groups because they're different, and I think that was the goal of that doc, was to try to get to drill in on like, we get that like this means different things to different people. Here's maybe how we see this applying differently, to those people, but we still need to think about those users, whether they're end users, developers, building on, library maintainers. I think we go sort of and split all of those groups out a bit.
I mean, coming back to Miles' point about, we actually say some key elements. We could actually soften that to like some examples, or like they're not meant to be an exhaustive list, or it's a non-exhaustive list, or these were things that came out of like in the brainstorming we did. These are specific things that people mentioned and that we actually workshopped together into the what are some of the things that people I believe go into developer experience, but it's not meant to be an exhaustive list either, right? So I don't know if I could see your point about like we could just have
like everything could be chalked up as developer experience if you stretch the term enough. Like fast performance is good developer experience, and good security is good developer experience. You know what I mean? So like there's a reason why we all agree that that's number one, because you group everything under it.
I think that's fine though. I think recognizing that those are components of good developer experience are very valid. And I don't think we want to limit developer experience in that way. And I really do think we just need to move those bullet points so that we don't get distracted by those individual items, because, that wasn't the point. Those were just like our list that we brainstormed. We just like threw them all into the bullet points and said, cool, right? Like this kind of is what we meant.
I think so. If it helps, we could, I think those are useful having somewhere so people have a little bit more concrete idea, but detaching them from the list, if it helps, makes sense.
I think it's a good idea, especially if we can have examples, or like being able to hold something and its opposite in your head at the same time is described as like one way of like knowing that someone's a genius. And I think being able to show that is true would be something that would be very useful for this document. Mostly in that like prioritizing developer experience can be done in a number of different ways that we've like discussed here.
Yeah.
And the reality is it's about the framework. So it's like, I care about speed, but it shouldn't be speed just for the sake of being fast. It should be speed for the sake of developer experience. And I think like that is kind of like the key that we're unlocking here, which is that like, and even Jeff, to what we were saying, it's like a worse developer experience today for a long-term better ecosystem developer experience is still like working towards that goal. So I think like this as a framework there is really useful, and perhaps like showing how the same thing can actually mean two different things. Here's a time where developer experience means it's slower, and here's a time where developer experience means it's faster, and here's a time where it means a worse developer experience today. Those are all still working within this framework, even if they're all in conflict with each other.
Right, and that experience, that example of speed is an interesting one because it also fits into operational qualities, but you want it for a different reason there. It's not necessarily because of developer experience, it's because we want to, have a reasonable cost when we run these things.
And maybe those lists could be, sorry, Jeff, go for it.
I was just gonna say, so I feel like we're debating two different things here. One is like, the specifics of this one bullet point if we're not rewriting the whole document. And the other is like, if we make big changes to the whole document. Could I maybe propose like, I think we're pretty close. I don't know how you guys feel about the language that I've highlighted. Maybe we could just like agree on this one bullet as if we're not going to rewrite the whole document, merge this in if we can come to a consensus on this. And then I'm all for, continuing the debate about what this broader document should be and how it should change and what intro text we should add and so on. But maybe that could be like a follow-up effort.
I'd agree with that for sure. Yeah.
I object. I think we should rewrite everything and boil the ocean, and there should be no incremental improvements, Jeffrey. I'm sorry.
He wants to add a big bullet at the top. Big core.
Right.
It's after 6 o'clock and all my gloves are
Yeah.
off.
So I guess let's try, and if we could close on just like a bullet point to add, I think that would be great.
I mean,
How do you feel about this?
Which one?
The one that's highlighted?
The one I see
PR?
highlighted is there, you've got highlighted. So
Jeff, you can open a PR and we can just bike shed it in asynchronously in the
well, we do have a PR that's open. That's how we started getting this on the. I mean, I think Wes, what's your take on that one? Because I
think it's great. I'm definitely, especially I don't think there's this is why I like the idea of changing the document, because I think this is a great point. But if we keep the document structure the way we are, we're going to have entire meetings dedicated to single points for the eternity of this group, which I don't think is very productive. Like, I'm super happy with this line, like, make this line, add it, commit it, let's get it merged. But like, let's definitely consider the future of this so that we don't have to bike shed, tons of very valid one-line changes.
Sure.
Right.
Although, to be fair, I think the value of this document is that, maybe haggling of this document will eat up a lot of time, but it should shorten a lot of other debates that are lower level among all of the working groups.
Totally. That's
as they decide how to,
and to be fair,
what to build.
I do think this was an oversight. And the only disagreement has ever been over like how strong it should be versus, because like I think not mentioning the compatibility is, we just should have anyway.
Yeah, totally agree. I didn't mean to say that the conversation is super valuable, but I think that we as a small group can have this effectively if everybody else who reads this, who's outside of this group, comes to these same conclusions.
Yeah.
That is like really effectively just trying to like bike shed the way it's worded or the order or whatever. Like, that's not going to make those other conversations as productive. No. It's going to make it harder in some cases. So I want to make sure that we don't make this document spread that pain around. The goal should be that it does what you described, Jeffrey, which is make those conversations just a lot easier.
Did anybody else show any concern in the?
Yeah, I think that's a valid concern, but if no one else has raised issues or open PRs like I have, then
right, yeah. So I'm also like, okay, there was only one, so
maybe you're just lucky so far, but But
I meant in the original PR itself, were there? I just know there was there was a little concern over maximize, but if
I'm fine with
the new wording that here. Yeah, the new wording here is, I think, great. So.
Yeah, I feel like there's a better way to phrase as is, but I don't know what it is. So if you can think of, if anyone wants to tweak the, I think we can just add this for now or something, and then
as is possible. Yeah. So why don't you update the PR for that? That seems reasonable to me.
Can I do that in here?
And okay. So that's good. And I guess we'll wait to look at those constituencies to the next meeting.
There, is that good?
If anybody has comments or whatever thoughts of next step, because hopefully we can move on to now getting, get those constituencies done, and we'll have the groundwork for some of the more detailed, like the more technical type discussions. But it seemed like we need to get these in place first. So.
Yeah, and for what it's worth, learning from this today's meeting, I think this was super valuable. I would love it if more people were like you, Jeffrey, and went and read this document and said, look, here, I think this is this other better way. Because this, I think, really challenged us, because it had been a pretty small group, I think, admittedly, and also a group that I think is not super representative of the broad contributor base. And so having folks like you come in and say, like, make these cases, I think will make this a lot better than it is today.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that was what was so interesting about the modules group, and that, because modules have such a big impact across the broader ecosystem, we had a lot of stakeholders that were like not Node collaborators, like leaders from TypeScript and you know, like package maintainers and things like that. I mean, some of the other working groups have some of that type of stuff too, but you know, I haven't been on other working groups, but I imagine that like they're probably much more focused on technical aspects of how do we implement this technology, that type of thing, than talking about like, well, what's the impact on the ecosystem and on the community going to be from, you know, what we build. So yeah, maybe that's just been kind of, I've had a different perspective. So I'm kind of assuming that maybe a lot of the other groups would benefit from that kind of perspective. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. So we'll see.
Okay, so I guess we're 10 minutes after. So thanks. I'll say thanks to everybody who came. Unless there's something that we think we absolutely need to get into before, instead of waiting till next meeting. If not, thanks for everybody, and we'll hopefully see everybody next time and talk about the constituency matrix that we have.
And if you want to approve that PR, I'd appreciate it.
Will do. Okay.
Thanks.
Talk to you later. Bye.
Bye.